When I went back to my friend and said, give me some names of some counselors, and the key guy said he had died, I thought, is that how I'm going to live my life? I'm just going to let time pass and eventually, I'm going to die and not do with the things of my life.
Welcome to the Crucible Project podcast. The Crucible Project is a nonprofit organization committed to creating a world of men and women who live with integrity, grace, and courage, helping them to fulfill their God-given purpose. This podcast will discuss important and sometimes difficult topics while delivering practical life applications with men and women who are currently practicing this work. We are igniting Christ-like change in men and women through experiences of radical honesty and grace.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crucible Podcast. My name is Andy Spell, and I will be doing our interview today. And I'm excited to welcome Chris Cleghorn to the podcast today. So, hello, Chris. Welcome.
Hi, Andy. It's really good to see you. First time in many years that we've actually been together at the same place by distance. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Man, it is so good to see you. So, Chris, I would love to start off today by you telling everyone just a little bit about yourself, things that we may need to know about you.
Oh, wow. Where to begin? So where I am today, I'm a man has reached the pinnacle. I'm over 70 now in that phase of my life. So I do a lot of looking back at what I've done in my life, mostly with gratitude and appreciation. Um, I live out in the Chicago area. I've been married to Ruth for, I think we're coming up on 48 years or 49 years or something like that.
Wow.
Long time. I was thinking a couple days ago about, I wonder actually how many marriages Ruth and I have had together, thinking about ups and downs. So that might be something to explore at some point. But anyway, so I'm now retired. I spent most of my working career overwhelmingly in working in large nonprofit organizations. My background is primarily fundraising and marketing. So I spent a long time at the national organization Easter Seals in Chicago and then some other places. I'm have three adult children who are all out there in the world paying taxes and mostly doing good. And I have seven grandchildren. So that's a little bit about me. There's more, but that's a start.
So you have the best job, the grandparent job.
That's right. That's right. It's great. It's
It's it's a
time
great
time limited. It's not 24-hour, not 24/7 the way it used to be.
right on, but it's a great fraternity for sure.
Yeah, that's right. It is. Yeah.
So I would love for you to tell us a little bit to the listening audience. What drew you to going to your Crucible weekend? Why did you go to your weekend?
Yeah. So I was in my mid 50s for about 10 years. I'd had this kind of internal dissatisfaction with my life. I was, on the outside, everything's pretty good. I certainly professionally, I was doing very, very well. I was sort of at a pinnacle of a career in fundraising, successful, and had a kind of something of a national reputation in the work that I did. So that part of my life was pretty awesome. And I had what I would characterize as an okay relationship with my wife, not that great, kind of a decent relationship with my then adult kids. I felt pretty distant from God. I think it was a pretty classic example of what was showing on the outside. The shiny stuff on the outside wasn't matching a pretty deep discontent. And there was a bit of a personal crisis that I had in my relationship with my wife. Actually, what happened was I had a friend who I'd gotten references for a counselor about 7, 8 years before, but I never went and saw the counselor. And so I went back to that man, and he said, well, one of the counselors that I recommended to you, he's since died, but he suggested that I go see a guy named Greg Houston. And I coached with a man named Greg Houston for several months. And then out of that relationship and out of what was going on in my life, I ended up at a Crucible weekend, which was, the most transformational experience of my life.
Mine too. It came right at the right time for me and when I needed it, and I had no clue how badly I needed it.
Yeah.
How did God show up on that weekend? What did God give you on that weekend?
So it was interesting. I was aware. So early in my life, when I was 13 years old, 2 months past my 13th birthday, I went in to wake up my dad. He and I had a pattern of having breakfast together every morning. I made breakfast. I'd wake him up. He'd go do his morning stuff. And went in to wake him up and said, "Daddy." And I shook his arm and he did not move. So at 13 years old, I experienced the loss of my father. And so I think my whole life I carried that as sort of as the kind of the key thing in my what I consider my emotional profile. Oh, I lost my dad at 13,
Yeah.
and so going into the weekend, I realized some of the things I was working on. I realized some of my distance with God was related to that. But something else I got out of my weekend was I realized there was much more going on in my life early on that formed me around sadness, and so on that weekend, I had an experience. Actually had an experience in seeing my relationship with God in a new way, my relationship with my father in a new way, and it really was like a new birth. So it was an astounding shift for me. And I left that weekend making I made two resolutions basically. I got to the weekend, I really had no relationships with men. There was no one I felt I could go to and be deeply authentic with. And I left the weekend deciding I'm going to go out and build relationships with men, and I'm going to keep going after God, kind of no matter what. And so that was the major shift for me out of that weekend. And then it definitely wasn't all up and to the right. Things got worse in many ways before they got better, but it really introduced me to a different way of living my life with more purpose and intention.
Yeah. And on that weekend, how did it seem safe for you to get to deal with the loss of your father and develop that a deeper relationship with God? What about that weekend made it safe for you to maybe go into some deep spaces that I don't know, maybe you had never really gone into?
It's easier having now staffed a lot of weekends to look back and see why it worked. But but when I went in, it was quite an unusual experience. I think a few of the elements that made it so effective was one. It was very much a stepping away out of completely separated from my normal life. So I was able to just be totally 100% focused on being there. And then everything just came to me as the experiences came as they were, somewhat like living life.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was going to happen next, and so when it happened, and then I just showed up the way I showed up. I think one of the things that made it safe was it was what we call it was a there were a lot of people there doing that journey with me, and then there was a team of volunteers there who had clearly done this journey, and they were there. Yeah, they made it safe. They made it
Yeah.
safe, even though they made it kind of weird.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, what a great weekend, because I didn't even really realize what I didn't realize some of the things I was going to work on while I was there. I didn't realize they were even a thing,
Yeah.
really.
Well, that's right. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I know Crucible does is there's a conversation they have with each man before he goes on the weekend, and ask him, what do you want? What is the thing you want to work on, or what's the thing you're focused on? And I remember I kind of didn't pass the interview that well. It was sort of like I knew I was willing to work on stuff, but I didn't really have a clear thing in mind. So, but it all became very clear, or at least for that weekend and what I needed at that time in my life. It was just right for me.
Yeah, I didn't pass the interview either, because my interviewer asked me what I wanted, and I wasn't sure. I was just like,
Right.
hey, I got invited, and I'm going to go on this thing.
Right. Right. Exactly. But I knew I had issues. I knew I had issues in my life to deal with.
Man, surely I did too.
Back to that recommendation about the counselor, I thought, when I went back to my friend and said, give me some names of some counselors, and the key guy said he had died, I thought, is that how I'm going to live my life? I'm just going to let time pass, and eventually, oh, I'm going to die and not deal with the things of my life. And yeah, so I'm so glad that I didn't put it off any longer.
Absolutely. So one of the things I want to talk to you about, and I know that you've done some work around this, and I know that Many people listening to this podcast maybe have experienced it as well. But I know that you've done some work around grief. And I was curious, what have you learned through the years in dealing with grief that you would love to pass on to folks? Some steps that they need to take, or just what have you learned about grief? Especially, what did you learn maybe grieving your father at a later date, as a 13-year-old? I think you said 13, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so as a 13-year-old, probably didn't even have a clue what it meant to grieve a major loss. But I would love to have a conversation around grief, if you don't mind.
Well, let me start out this way. Um, I can remember at some point in my life, I don't know when it was, I might have been in my 20s, I picked up Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's study about grief. And I think she had 5 phases, 5 stages of grief. And now sometimes they're called the 6 or the 7 or the 12 stages of grief. When my father died, it was just such a profound injustice in my mind. It just did not make sense. And another dynamic that was going on for me was, frankly, I really had a lot more affection, connection with my father than with my mother, who, she had her own journey, that a painful journey in her life. And so that was one of my discoveries on my weekend. Is I had always been a sad little boy, and partly it was related to my relationship with my mom.
And that relationship with your mom not being great was its own, what I've learned, was its own form of grief as well, right?
Well, that's right. Right. There was a way of the way that she was raised, and she didn't really know any better. So there was a harshness. There was a sense I picked up of, I'm bad. I did bad things, but I kind of had this core view of myself that I was bad. So, and I think that's one of the things I'm leading to, is that one of the things I've learned about grief is that frequently for people, there's some episode that's so profound, so big that they can't shake it. The death of a spouse, the loss of a child. But it could be something too, like a completely unexpected firing from a job. uh, Grief is not just the results of that one experience, but that there's a layering of losses that we have. My cat dying, or, my father dying, not getting into a college. All these are forms of losses, and they have a cumulative effect on us. And we take them in. We take in losses. So one thing I realized about grief is that it's layered, as I said, and people carry it. The other thing is that it doesn't seem like there's not a clear path. When I read Kubler Ross, it was like, oh, first there's anger, then there's whatever it is, it's denial, then it's bargaining, then it's whatever. And my experience and working with people in grief is that there's no right way. It doesn't come in an ordered way. There are these things that show up, and they show up in different ways at different times. And so there's no formula for someone to follow. And I feel a lot of people, my experience is that they feel like, oh, I'm not grieving right. And my experience with them is the most important thing is set aside time to allow yourself to grieve, and get in places where you have the time and the attention of someone else to be with you, to hold that, and just be present with you. And so, I don't think there's not like 6 easy steps or anything like that. It's living a journey. I had an unusual experience. It was the same thing going back to getting to my Crucible weekend. I was different things were going in my life, kind of not working. I'm in my mid 50s, and I was watching a TV show. It was Mad About You, and I'm
Great
not
show,
sure.
by the way.
Yeah.
I loved it. Yeah.
So there was one episode where the main character, I think it's Paul Reiser, he has some interaction with his father. So Paul Reiser, I don't know, he's maybe 40 and his father's 60, and there's some kind of conflict, and it's all comedic. And it's a Saturday afternoon in the middle of summer, and something hit me. It was like out of nowhere, and it hit me. I didn't have a dad. I'm
Mm.
50. It's 40 years later, and there was something about that show that touched me in a way. And I remember turning off the TV. I remember saying, I miss my dad. I miss my dad. It was 40 years. And I remember I was in my backyard, middle of summer. I was actually wailing in my backyard. And then I was regretting all the things. He never knew my wife. He never knew my kids. He never saw me graduate from college. He never saw anything that I did. So my point about that is that I think grief, it sits in there and it could come out at any time. And I guess I believe we need to find ways to welcome it in ourselves and with those around us that we love and care for.
Absolutely. I think what surprised me when my father passed, good night. I think it's just 11 or 12 years ago.
Hmm.
Uh, and it was sudden. We knew it was coming, but it was pretty sudden. And, I don't know. We're probably never ready for it.
Right.
But I remember, I feel like I'm such an open person. I've kind of been one that I told myself that I lived with my emotions well and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. I
Yeah.
realized a lot of that was deceiving myself with some of the emotions. But it's an open book, and I'm going to do these things, and I'm going to do them on the outside. And I found that grief made me absolutely want to go inside.
Hmm.
I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to
Hmm.
talk to people about it. I remember my wife has an aunt who's a sweet woman, and the week after we got home from the funeral and doing things that we needed to do, she said she wanted to come over on a Thursday night and just check on me and see how I was doing. She lives in our area, and I remember telling my wife, "No, she
Hmm.
doesn't have the right to ask me about my grief. I don't want to talk to her." And I thought it was such a weird response for me to
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
this very kind woman, I don't want her to ask me. It was strange. And then I started realizing I don't know how to do grief right. And
Hmm.
I thought there was probably a right way. And I'd even probably judged other people and thought, man, they're not judging right. They're not grieving right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Andy. So it sounds like, yeah, you were sort of judging yourself that you're not doing it right, and you were just doing what Andy needed to do at that time.
Right.
And I'm imagining there were different phases where you got a chance to explore that with other people, or talk it out, or vent the anger or the sense of loss or whatever. But it's at your own timing, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's been, at different times, it seems like it's the most prevalent for me still that when there is uh, a life event, like my dad didn't get to see any of my children get
Hmm.
married.
Right.
And I remember that that made me sad, or, that the grandkids are being born, and thinking to myself, my dad would have loved these grandkids,
Hmm.
or my dad would have loved this wedding, or he would have loved this, or he would have loved that. It's just all these things that I think about. And there's times that, and the emotions will pour out of me, and I don't even realize they're coming. And all of a sudden I'm just in tears 11 years later, thinking, wow, I wish it had been here. One of the things that we've always believed is that cardinals, I know a lot of people believe this, but cardinals are people that have passed on, that they show up as a
Oh,
cardinal.
okay.
And
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that. Yeah.
yeah, and so I was performing my youngest son's wedding, and we were outside in this venue, and we were in the middle of me doing the vows with he and his sweet bride, and I look up and this cardinal flew in and landed in a tree right as we were doing the vows, and I thought,
Mm-hmm.
he decided he wanted to show up anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's beautiful. When talking about your dad passing away 11 or so years ago, so my father died at 46, heart attack, died in his sleep, or he died in bed. I don't know if he got, I don't know specifically what happened, but we found him in the morning. So 46, my mother lived to 90. And, at 13 years old, we were taken out of the house. We went and stayed with a friend. I realized what they were doing was they were coming and taking away the body. Uh, and so I remember having the experience of all these things happened at the time that I wasn't present with. And so when my mother died about 12, 13 years ago, 14 years ago now, I realized I tried to be very present with things around my mother. I wasn't actually there when she died, but I came in. She was in Maine. I flew in from Chicago. I had some quiet time speaking to her. Her body was there. I remember kissing her. I remember wanting to be fully engaged in the reality of the loss that was happening in my life. And I found that very, I don't know, just made a lot of sense for me to not be hidden away at all, but actually to be very present. Y- I had the opportunity to do that, and of course, we don't always have the chance to do that.
right.
It depends, and of course, there's lots of other grief, lots of other causes of grief, but I think the most profound, I think, is the losses through death.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are other losses, and I know one of the things that I love about some of the grief classes that we do at our church and grief seminars, it almost always seems like those are just around, not just around death. That sounds terrible. Are around death,
Hmm.
but there
Hmm.
can be other losses, and I'm wondering, how do you help people walk through some of those other life things that maybe feel like deaths or major losses that do bring grief? How do you help people walk through those things? I lost a job, and it was devastating,
Hmm.
and I didn't know how to deal with it because one, I had to sign an NDA, so I really wasn't even supposed to speak about it.
Right, right, yeah, right. Say nothing. Yeah, exactly. You have this profound thing, and then you're prohibited from even talking about it. So,
Right.
or any conversation you have, you're actually in violation of an agreement. So it's a very strange, yeah. And of course, that's a perfect example of denial, which
Yeah.
isn't really very helpful for any of us psychologically or emotionally.
Right.
So, a couple of thoughts I have about this. So first of all, I think grief gets embodied; it's in us, and so I think, and I've seen this. I had this experience myself. People need a way to kind of process the grief in their body. I mean, I think that's what crying does. Crying is a way of that. So one of the things I had an experience in a retreat I did once. It wasn't related to Crucible. It was similar kinds of men's work, and part of that retreat or that experience was a ritual, a grieving ritual, where we actually were able to go back and physically express, move, carry things, hit things, and actually kind of fully embody all the emotions around our grief.
Wow.
It was actually one of the most profound experiences I had, and I never realized how much anger can be tied into our grief. I guess grief is all around sadness, but there could be a lot of anger. So I think that the ability to find some ritual way to process grief is helpful. I think one way to do that, it could be simple things. And often it needs to be guided by someone else, but do it in some kind of community, paired up with someone, or in a small group or community. And maybe you've done this kind of work, Andy. But I've seen things where people will do something like take symbols of a loss. People do this around divorces, for example. They'll take some sort of symbol of a loss, and they might take it and bury it or burn it or something as a way of just processing in a ritual way. Uh, something happened in the real world. So I do think there's that thing about something that we carry in our bodies that gives us an outlet for doing it, kind of metaphorically or ritually, but it's real. And then, of course, I think the kindly aunt who wanted to come and check in on you. I mean, her gift was the gift of presence, really,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and you didn't want it then, and maybe you didn't want it from her, and that could make sense. But I do think part of that process is someone who you can go to and just be with someone, and then they can put out whatever's out there. I have this. I mentioned to you briefly. I've been leading a group of men for the last couple years. We meet just once a month, but these are men who've had yeah, I guess one of the worst kinds of losses, which is they've had a child who died, by
Yeah. Ooh.
suicide or drug overdose, or in one case, man's son took his life by shooting himself.
Mm.
And so here these men are, in their 30s up to 70, and they have this experience of losing, I mean, the normal procedure is that we go before our children.
Yeah. Right.
And so again, it's creating a space for them. What they report is, they're out in the world, and for some it's fresh, for some it's further away, and things come up. And where do they have a place to actually process this? So having some place to go that they can count on and say it's okay to come here and express your anger or whatever you have to, or just sadness. And
Yeah. And how long have some of these men been with you? Like, how long? What length have these men been doing this together?
well, I think we started maybe 2.5 years ago or something like that, and some had just had recent experiences. Some had gone back a few years before then. And some stayed and some cycled out of the group. And then, unfortunately, new men had the opportunity to come because they had just lost a child. Uh, we call this group the club.
Yeah.
And the reason we call it the club, they named it, which was it's a very exclusive membership. And they really don't want more members because the price of entry is so high. So it's a place to go. It's not certainly the full part of their healing, but it's a place where they can go and have that kind of support and care. And I believe people need that. They need a place, and they need relationships of trust. That's the other thing is can I trust you to hold this and hold me?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that gets in the way, and I've heard this from people, and it always, man, makes the hair stand up on the back of my head. If I had any, I'm bald, but if I had any, it would do that. Is
I don't see anything to stand up there.
that's right. It's when people say, "Well, I thought they'd get past it.
Yeah,
Isn't it time
right.
for them to be past that? Or why, man? It's time for them to get over it." And I think, golly, Chris, why is that? Why are those words so dangerous that to be told, man, I think it's time for you, or haven't you gotten over this yet?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. It's the idea that, oh, there's a right way to do this. There's only one right way, and each person's on his or her own journey, and they're processing at his or her own pace. And these losses are always with us. I mean, we carry these losses because we loved. I think I've learned that deeply in Crucible work, is that we feel pain because our hearts were invested in relationships, people who are important to us, and so we want to stay connected. So they stay with us. I have on my ankle I was 15 years old. I was out on a little camping trip with some friends, and I had an axe, and I went up to this dead tree, and I was going to cut down this tree. The axe ended up in my ankle. I ended up with 20 stitches. Uh, so that was 55 years ago, roughly. And when I touched that spot, there's still a tenderness there.
Wow.
And so we have these wounds, and they are tender places. And I think what we learn to do is we learn to accept and surrender, and they get healing mostly through that. But I think the impact of the cut always has some tenderness connected to it. And then there's also the reminder of what was the gift or blessing in the relationship or the situation that we had too.
Yeah. I want to ask a couple questions about the group of men you meet with. And I agree. That's a club that, man, I do not want to join.
Right.
Like I'm telling you right now, and I don't think absolutely nobody wants to join that club. Yeah, but what do they get in this group that they may not get from a spouse or a parent, or what is it about this group that gives them the space of healing and grieving and walking together?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. What they get from each other is I have been where you are, and I am where you are. So there's the shared experience of being a parent, being a father, and losing a child. There aren't that many people around. So there's this ability to identify with one another, and then to share the experience of, oh yeah, the way my wife has processed this with me. Let me share what I've learned. She's on her journey. So they bring something to one another. They have the wisdom of a shared experience, which is very, very, very powerful. I actually feel in a way like I'm sort of not really qualified to be the facilitator of this group because I don't have their specific grief. What I have is a tenderness or compassion for their journey. But what they give to each other is shared experience, and then there's also sort of this, you know, yeah, I've been down this road. So there's this recognition of they can see in one another of I've had that experience, and they're able to encourage each other, and they're also able to be available to each other. So someone who hasn't had that experience, hasn't gone through that, it's not like they're not open to the compassion of others, but they do share something that's unique for them.
Yeah, and I would imagine that when they're there and they're sharing, there's a tenderness and an understanding that they wouldn't get anywhere else. And also, a grace that's afforded and a non-judgment given
Right.
that
Yeah.
they might feel somewhere else.
Yeah. Right. I think totally that there's a sense of, oh yeah, here I am. And a man might have some judgments of himself, but what he receives from the others are complete acceptance and an extension of grace. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture of grace, of just of tenderness and sharing someone else, holding someone else. Yeah, so that, and they'll say that, I'm at work, or and something will come up at work. I'll have an experience, but I can't really talk to my colleague about this because they won't understand. And they also share about how they get surprised where something hits them. Kind of like my example, 40 years later with Paul
Yeah,
Reiser, that they have those experiences. So yeah, there's something quite beautiful. It's also somewhat the typical group experience, like, oh, I didn't want to come, but I'm glad I did, because
right.
I was able to receive something for myself and walk with a brother and hold him.
There may be somebody listening who is experiencing grief and is finding it hard to even talk to someone about it. They're finding it hard to process it. They're judging themselves. They need to be doing it right, but they're not. And today they're just feeling, just from our conversation, they're feeling a deep sadness, a deep heaviness. What words would you give to someone that's made it to this part of the podcast who's just feeling incredibly sad, lonely, scared, angry? Man, what word of compassion would you give to them right now? And then a word of suggestion for them.
Well, the word of compassion is just, yeah, how tender, how much compassion I feel for you, particularly if you don't feel that you have a place to go or a person to share with. It occurs to me that that would be one of the most important things to do, is take the risk of finding a relationship where someone would agree to be with you and hold you. Hold you, maybe physically, but what I mean is hold your create space for you and be present with you and allow you to just process and emote and express. We have a God who loves us. I think prayer is helpful, but the embodiment of the presence of love with another human is really, to me, the most powerful thing. And interesting, you gave the example, Andy, of you, that you didn't want to talk with anyone. You went inside, but I would encourage you to, whoever's someone listening in that situation, to reach out. I think there's another thing that I didn't mention before. I think there's a restorative power in intentionally being in nature around our
Mm,
loss. So a walk in a woods or a field, and just being present with kind of the created world. Life and death are that's actually part of kind of the ongoing reality of existence. And so being in a setting where, we can be reminded of that, the falling leaves from a tree. I mean, that's a symbol. I mean, it's a reality. Those leaves are dying. Those leaves, they've served their purpose. And so that's one of the things that occurs to me, is finding ways to essentially connect with God, connect with the divine through nature. So those are a couple of thoughts I had. But I'd also say get help and find a way to process, find a way to get that kind of acceptance, and don't give up until you do.
absolutely. Yeah. And man, in your local areas, there may be grief groups. There may be all kinds of things. I agree. Don't do it alone. And I'm going to throw this out here. Chris and I are both coaches in Crucible, and you can find us on the website. I am not a grief counselor. Chris has said he is not a grief counselor either, but he's walked through grief and he understands that and works with people, and I've done the same. And I would say even go on the website and look for our names, and we could at least have a conversation with you and help you find maybe some places to get that grief help that you would need.
There are good resources. I'd be willing to do that. I know you do that kind of work, Andy. That's part of your calling, is to
Right.
to be with people in those kinds of situations. But there are really good resources, grief groups, and it's a lot available online. A beautiful book that I came across about 5 years ago is something by Francis Weller called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It's a beautiful book about processing grief. So, I guess books aren't the answer, but I found that really helpful for me to think about my own experience, and there are others as well.
Yeah, but the main thing is, I think you're right. Do it with someone. Find a group to do it with, and
Yeah,
find safe places to do that.
yeah.
Chris, any other words you would want to give us before we wrap this up today?
I don't know. It's fun. It's fun to be with you, Andy.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm glad to do that. Um, it's interesting. Life is a great initiator, a great teacher, and there's this line. I can't remember who said it, but God comes to us disguised as our life. And I think grief is certainly a big part of that, that there's a godness in our experiences. And yeah, they really help us grow. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't have a profound wisdom of the ages to share, but I'm really tender for people who are dealing with grief. Yeah, it's just my heart goes out to you, and I encourage you to get the support and care that you need and you deserve.
Absolutely. And the only other thing I would say to folks is that your ability to walk through grief and grow may absolutely be a ministry opportunity that you can bring to someone else.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing that, for example, with the men in this group that we described, exactly that, not just with each other, but with others in their churches and other relationships. I've seen that
Man,
for sure. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Good to be with you. God
Good to be
bless.
with you. God bless.
For more information about our weekends, please go to thecrucibleproject.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rate and review wherever you are listening, and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Also, don't forget to check out myjourney2.com for your free 2-week trial. That's myjourneyto.com. Thank you for listening.